Good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon, and I'm with the Colorado Statewide Internet Portal Authority. In today's webinar, we will learn about Resultant's rapid prototyping technology to help you analyze data more quickly. Joining us are Blythe Wildridge, Marketing Manager, hopefully at some point Steve Abdallah, Client Partner Manager, and Anderson Smith, Senior Consultant. Before we get started, please go ahead and turn on captioning if you need or desire that, and note that during this webinar, you're muted. If you have questions or would like to communicate with the presenters at any point during the webinar, please use the chat box or the Q&A feature. We will unmute everyone at the end for any remaining questions. We'll also have some poll questions for you to answer during the presentation and a post-webinar survey, and we deeply appreciate your feedback. Please welcome our guests, Steve, Anderson, and Blythe. We greatly appreciate their time and look forward to what they have to share. Also on the call is SIPA's Sales and Marketing Director, Beth Justice, Sales Operation Manager Heather Nelson, and Operations Assistant Sarah Fisher, if you have any questions for us. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to the Resultant team.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Well, thank you all for joining this webinar. I'm excited to share a little bit more about our rapid prototyping team at Resultant and kind of what that approach looks like for us, and also share a little bit about how you can start to utilize that approach on your own. I'm Anderson Smith, and I lead our rapid prototyping team here at Resultant. So just a little bit about me. My background is originally actually in engineering, but I've spent the last 7 years or so of my career really focusing on kind of what we do at Resultant as a whole on the intersection of people and data and technology. So I've really been focusing a lot on how we can best solve complex human-centric problems, which really, honestly, almost all problems that we face are human-centric problems, but how we can solve that utilizing data and utilizing technology. So I'll talk a little bit about that today, specifically focusing on our rapid prototyping approach. And just kind of the quick agenda, I'll go through a little bit of some background as far as, do we have a problem? Is there something that we need to solve with rapid prototyping? I'll talk a little bit about mitigating that problem, and then get into the heart of rapid prototyping as far as what it is, how does it work, a few example projects that we've worked on, and then talk about how you can get started with it. Do we have a problem? I think you'll see that the answer to that is yes, but let me walk through a little bit of the data behind that. Especially with technology projects can be really complex, and they can just feel really, really gray and hard to understand, especially for folks that aren't really well versed within the technology space. And I think a lot of that is the reason behind why some projects fail so often, specifically with technology projects. As far as technology projects that overrun their timeline, it's actually about 2/3 of projects that aren't completed within the expected or initially planned timeline. And also, of course, if projects overrun their timeline, they oftentimes go over budget as well. And it's about half of projects that, or just shy of half of projects that overrun their budget. Even when projects are finally implemented, oftentimes those projects may require some sort of a rework where, sure, the project was delivered, but it doesn't exactly meet the full need of the solution. So it's about half of projects that are implemented that actually end up requiring rework. About a quarter of projects completely fail, and projects categorized as projects that completely fail would be those that either do not actually end up coming to completion and getting implemented, or those that are implemented, but after implementation just aren't actually utilized because they're not actually solving the true need of the problem. And then finally, it's about a quarter of projects that are true successful projects that don't completely fail, of course, and that don't require rework. So certainly I would say based on that, there definitely is quite a bit of room for improvement there with the delivery of technology projects. As far as why projects fail, there's, of course, a myriad of reasons for why projects may fail. I've listed a couple of those up here on the screen. Unclear objectives is certainly a big one that drives that when, before starting a project, the teams don't exactly really know what outcome they want to bring about. And I think we see this even more so in the technology and the data space, and are seeing that even more so now with new technologies like artificial intelligence. So with a lot of the new buzz around chatbots and things of that nature, there's certainly quite a bit of value that those can provide. But also it's pretty important to ensure that objectives are clear. And when we get into some solutions that feel a little bit more like black box solutions, I think it can be really hard to have clarity around what some of those objectives are. Machine learning is another one where it's a really, really powerful tool that our team certainly utilizes quite often. But again, it's really important to understand the objectives of a project before starting that, because when it's such a black box solution, I think people can get a little bit excited just about the technology or the concept, and can really oftentimes skip over that step of, what are the objectives? How will we actually get there? So that's certainly a reason why projects may fail. Another one here is lack of understanding of the true need, and that's certainly very related to the unclear objectives item. Another one that we oftentimes see is the wrong tech stack and or solution design, where we may just lock into a tech stack before really exploring what all of the options may be for a technology or for a data project. And that, of course, can lead to a project that fails, or simply an inefficient solution where either we may be over-engineering a solution and building something out that's a little bit more expensive or a little bit more time intense than may truly be necessary. And we'll actually get into an example of that a little bit further on in the presentation, where we talk about some of the rapid prototyping projects that we've done. Certainly non-existent or shifting requirements, again, related to the objectives. Of course, you want to understand the objectives behind a project. And then along with that, certainly want to build out some of those requirements too. It looks like we've got some answers here from the poll as far as, why it is for all of you that projects may fail. And it looks like it's kind of a good scatter of that, as far as, certainly I'll actually pull this up here. Unclear objectives, pretty common. Lack of understanding of the true need, not quite as frequent, but certainly one that may drive project failure. Looks like wrong tech stack isn't quite happening as frequently, and certainly non-existent or shifting requirements is a big one.
And Anderson, we had a question in the chat on failures. Do you have numbers on lack of adoption to the change?
I don't have the specific breakdown for that. No. That certainly is a big one that we've seen, though, is just solutions that are implemented but that aren't adopted. And that's something that we've actually been pushing quite a bit over the last couple of years at Resultant with our projects, is putting together a change management plan, and actually stood up a team focused on that, because that was something that we really saw quite often, again, especially with data projects, where the team may come up with a really sophisticated solution, but if it's not actually adopted by the end users, if they don't see the value in it, if they don't know how to use it, then certainly that really can limit the actual benefit of the solution. So that's definitely a big component of that project failure. But I don't have the specific breakdown there. These four on the right-hand side: unaligned team, unrealistic schedule, lack of accountability, and lack of support from leadership, also certainly can drive project failure. With rapid prototyping, I'll focus a little bit more so on those reasons on the left-hand side, as far as how we can really mitigate those with rapid prototyping. So that's what I want to get into a little bit next here, is mitigating that problem. So again, a part of that mitigation plan is realizing that technology projects are about people, and how important a people-first mindset is to solving those problems. Of course, technology is used as a big component of that, but we want to make sure that the technology is serving the needs of the people, serving the needs of the stakeholders and the end user, and not the other way around where we're serving the technology. Oftentimes, especially with solution creep in projects, the emphasis is focused a little bit too much on the solution and kind of builds from the solution out to the problem as far as, okay, here's our solution. How can we use that solution to address our problem? Then how does addressing that problem impact the business? And finally, okay, how does that impact the people within the business? And that's kind of a more traditional approach there, working from the solution out. But one key way to help mitigate some of those issues is by working from kind of the outside in, taking a people first approach, really understanding who the end users will be, really understanding the business well, the needs of the business, what change the business is trying to drive or what value the business is trying to provide, and then focusing on the solution that can then kind of work its way back out to solve all of those needs, but ensuring that we're taking a people first approach in all of this. And to do that, we like to use something called the design thinking methodology. And that starts with empathy, understanding that every problem has a human element and really understanding the human element of that problem. So that involves a lot of discovery work, sitting down with stakeholders, not just sitting down with leadership, but sitting down with the stakeholders, sitting down with the end users of the solution, and understanding really what that human element is. Then after that initial step of empathy, we of course need to define what it is that we're trying to solve. What's the issue, really putting guardrails around that so we understand the core of the issue and what we're trying to solve. And then once we have those two items, we can get into then ideating solutions. We certainly don't want to start ideating solutions too soon, because then we could get locked into a solution before we really have understood the human component of it and have understood what it is that we're trying to solve. And then with the design thinking methodology, for that ideation step, we'd like to think really big. All ideas are welcome. Ideation is different from directly solutioning. Ideation is coming up with a very broad list of possible options. And oftentimes you have to think really big to then narrow down. So getting some of those outlandish ideas out there may actually help in the long run, because even if you don't go with that idea, it may spark another one, and then you can then at the end kind of narrow those down through doing prototyping and through doing testing. And that's what I'll be focusing on quite a bit today, is that prototyping and that testing component, where, as opposed to going from the ideation phase and building out a really, really long list of detailed requirements, a long project plan for, a year long, or perhaps even a multi-year long project, and defining every single small detail of what we'll do in that project up front, we like to actually jump into prototyping. And this certainly doesn't apply for all projects. There are, of course, some projects where you know exactly what it is that you need to implement. Of course, you do need to have all of the requirements defined. You do need to build out a project plan and take kind of a more formal, more traditional approach to that project. But there are some projects that fit into being a good fit for rapid prototyping, which are projects that may be a little bit less defined, where you don't know what the solution is that you need defined. You don't know the tech stack that you want to use. You have an idea of the approach that you want to take, but you don't know if it's feasible. And those are all types of projects that fit in really well for rapid prototyping. And with rapid prototyping, we like to ideate through prototypes pretty quickly and just develop a test model, especially if it's a data-focused project or a project that involves a user interface or dashboards. We oftentimes find it's much more efficient to actually just jump into prototyping and get something tangible in front of stakeholders that they can see, they can touch, they can feel, and they can provide feedback on. And we'll iterate through those two steps through 4 and 5 pretty quickly, with putting together a quick prototype to convey the idea, testing it out with end users and stakeholders, getting feedback, and then circling back to ideation, to prototyping, to testing, and really just have a very strong bias towards action throughout that process. And focusing on prototyping and testing, rapid prototyping, as I mentioned, involves rapid iterations of prototype development. And some of the benefits of that are we get really clear feedback on a tangible solution, because sometimes you can just go in circles, focusing on requirements, talking about requirements without actually seeing what that may look like and what that may feel like. You get a clear understanding of the desired solution as well through rapid prototyping. So then once you do decide to build out a production ready solution, you really know what that solution will look like and feel like, and you're sure that that solution will truly meet the needs of the stakeholders or of the users. We also see through rapid prototyping decreased time to value and decreased cost to value. So along with ensuring that the solution's the right one, it can oftentimes really accelerate the development process of projects. And finally, that last piece there, the de-risked production solution development, so that you don't get halfway through a project and then realize, oh, well, this isn't exactly what we had in mind, or this doesn't exactly truly solve the need that we have here. So it really is a good way to do all of those three items: to decrease time to value, to decrease cost to value, and to de-risk production solutions. So as far as what it actually is, we've kind of talked around rapid prototyping quite a bit, but haven't really truly gotten into what it is. So what is rapid prototyping? It's simply just a way to develop innovative proof of concept solutions for complex challenges in short, time-bound engagements. And we've talked quite a bit already about the why behind that, so I won't spend too much more time on that point. But the approach for rapid prototyping, a very key tenet to that is the time-bound component. It's really important to know that rapid prototyping projects are not meant to be production-ready solutions. As I referenced earlier, if you are ready to build out a production-ready project, if you already have everything defined for that project, you have all of your requirements, you know the tech stack, you absolutely know that it truly does meet the needs of the end users, then that may not be a good candidate for a rapid prototyping project. And it's important with rapid prototyping projects as well, around that time-bound component, to really make that clear with whoever the stakeholders are for that project, whether it be a client of yours, whether it be your leadership team, whether it be your own team who will be utilizing that end solution, is to let them know that it's time-bound, to time-bound that, and let them know that it won't be a production-ready solution. It's oftentimes we hear individuals who, with rapid prototyping, they really honestly kind of want it to be a production-ready solution, but just faster and cheaper. And that's, of course, not necessarily what rapid prototyping is meant to do. It can certainly get you there more quickly, but the prototype itself is just that. It's a prototype, and it's important to set expectations around that, and to bound the time pretty well there for prototyping projects. And of course, to have a really strong bias towards action and towards development. And you'll see here the rapid prototyping process mirrors pretty closely what design thinking is, as far as going through the phases of empathizing, where you engage and listen with the stakeholders, defining the root problem, defining what success looks like for a solution that would solve that problem, ideating through any potential ideas, and then focusing on the actual prototype and testing components there. And that's very cyclical in nature. The first prototype that we get to very likely won't be the final solution. And that's fine. It's not meant to be the final solution. It's just meant to accelerate that ideation and feedback cycle so that we can then get to a final solution more quickly. You can really use rapid prototyping for any project. Our team specifically focuses on these 4 areas that are pretty heavy in the data space, doing data analytics, visualization, and reporting. doing data modeling work, which is more so in the advanced and predictive analytics space, doing data-informed strategy, where we can help to make business decisions or strategic decisions utilizing data and analytics. And then also on the user interface design side of things. So for application development or even dashboard development, just building out low fidelity and then high fidelity wireframes before we get to an actual production development of either a dashboard or a custom application. So how does it work? I'll get into our process here. And it's important to note that this is the process that we use, but this certainly isn't the only way to approach rapid prototyping. The key things for rapid prototyping are having a team that has enough time dedicated to it, where they can really focus whatever that amount of time is, where they can really focus a heavy amount of hours on that prototype project and really be able to go heads down on that work, and that it's not overlapping too much with their independent duties. That you time bound that project, as I mentioned earlier, where you say, okay, we'll do a rapid prototyping project. We're going to cap it at 4 weeks. We'll try to iterate through different designs. And at the end of that 4 weeks, our goal, of course, is to have a clear understanding of that solution and what that would look like, so we can build it out in a production state. And those are really the two biggest tenets behind rapid prototyping. You can use it for almost any type of problem that your team may face, or almost any type of solution that you may want to build out. We've formalized it a little bit more with our team, and this has kind of been just through trial and error over the last couple of years. We built out this framework and have adjusted it over time to make it work for us. So we split it up into these 6 different phases, and it's pretty important to note, as you see on the right-hand side there, that these phases do not do not take place necessarily one after the other in a linear format. There's quite a bit of cycling back between phases. There's certainly quite a bit of overlap between phases where some of these may take place in parallel. And we're always circling back to build, demo and feedback, rebuild, demo and feedback. If we need to, we may go from demo and feedback all the way back to idea selection, to re-ideate through some ideas and select a new idea to try out and see how we like the overall feel of it. So the phases that we go through formally are ideation, idea selection, requirements gathering, build, demo and feedback, and handover. And I'll walk through each of these in a little bit more detail here. So the first phase on ideation, depending on which route we are going, we'll either identify a potential problem or identify an existing solution that may be able to be applied. We'll frame that problem, of course, identify the stakeholders and validate the problem with the stakeholders. Because sometimes you'll hear from leadership or from some end users that there may be a problem, and then when you go to validate it with others, it may honestly not truly be an issue that's worth solving, or others may have additional ideas to add into that are very related. So it's important to really identify those stakeholders and validate the problem with those stakeholders. And then this is just some of the kind of more formality around our approach, since we're typically working with clients outside of our own company, is just executing an NDA and kind of getting all of the T's and C's in place before we gain access to data, just to protect both parties there. Getting into idea selection, we'll identify value criteria for comparison. This is once we have a couple ideas that are generated, we like to be able to compare those ideas from kind of an apples to apples standpoint. So we'll typically assess them through value and feasibility, where based on that specific solution, we'll build out some different components there that will help drive that final value and feasibility score. But essentially, it's just then a trade-off of, okay, the feasibility axis, if you will, is simply just how challenging is this to implement? And then the value, of course, is how much value does it drive for the organization? And we'll use that to be able to compare ideas, especially if we've generated quite a few different ideas across a company or across a division. It may be important to be able to vet those ideas a little bit before we actually identify one specific idea to build out, or a couple different ideas to build out in a prototype. And then, of course, once we've selected that idea or those ideas, we'll get approval from stakeholders to make sure that, again, circling back to feedback from stakeholders, making sure that that idea is something that's maybe not be the end-all be-all solution, but is an idea that's worth prototyping out so that they can have something a little bit more tangible to give feedback on. We'll get in then to really requirements gathering and a bit more discovery, where ideally we like to do this if your company is all in person. This may be best to be able to do just with an in-person whiteboarding session. If you're not able to all get in the same room, then of course there's plenty of other solutions online where you can do kind of a virtual whiteboarding session together. So we'll usually use Lucid Spark for that and kind of just pull up a big whiteboard, give everyone collaborative access to be able to collaborate on that. And then I like to frame it out beforehand and oftentimes focus on the background behind the problem, what the data is that's going into the solution, what the technology constraints are behind the solution, and then what the end user needs are for that solution. And we'll kind of frame that out in that manner and just walk through that whiteboard with everyone, start to jot down ideas, start to jot down thoughts, and then just build it out as we go, and track comments, track feedback, track changes in that, and be able to really define those in a pretty collaborative manner. We'll, of course, define the technology constraints, the business rules, and then develop those requirements for that solution. And then typically send it out to the group after just to confirm those requirements before we get into the build portion. Then once we get into the build portion, this is really the bulk of the rapid prototyping projects. A lot of this here for ideation, idea selection, requirements gathering, that all may take place over the course of anywhere between 1 to 3 meetings. So it's stretched out a little bit more here as I'm walking through it, but that honestly takes place pretty quickly, especially for rapid prototyping projects, just because we want to get into the build here, because that's certainly the bulk of a project. If we do say we do a project that's 6 weeks long, we may spend week 1 on those first 3 phases, and then the next 4 weeks will be on phase 4 and phase 5, the actual build, demo feedback, and just iterating through some different prototypes there. And then, of course, the last week will be the handover. This build component really changes depending on what type of project it is that we're solving. Oftentimes, if we're working on a project, for example, that uses sensitive data, so say it's a project in the healthcare space, we may oftentimes just for the prototype use synthetic data or mock-up data just to accelerate things, since that can oftentimes really get us through prototyping in a much more accelerated manner, as opposed to having to deal with some of those slowdowns as far as getting access to data, standing up a secure environment, which of course are items that need to happen before a production build out and before interacting with any sensitive data. But due to that strong bias towards action with a rapid prototyping project, oftentimes we'll work with a partial set of data as far as what's available or with synthetic data. Then we'll get into the demo and feedback, which is pretty straightforward. It's just walking through what we've come up with a prototype and getting feedback from the stakeholders. This really takes place quite often. If we're doing a project over the course of 6 weeks, we may iterate through anywhere between 4 to 6 versions of a prototype. So we're typically doing these reviews at a minimum a weekly basis just to get feedback as we go along. And an important thing here, really for all projects, but especially with rapid prototyping, to make sure that the team that's developing that prototype knows that it is not only more than okay, but it should not be a perfect solution when walking through the demo. It's okay to demo something that's partially built out. It's okay to show partial functionality. It's okay to show something that's drawn on a whiteboard as opposed to something that may be built out formally in Figma when showing wireframes, for example. And that's the way it should be, is, just having a bias towards getting something together, making it more tangible to those reviewing that prototype, and getting feedback on that often, so that you can iterate through quite a few prototypes over the course of a project. The last piece then is handover, which is pretty straightforward, just holding a project retrospective with the team, documenting any takeaways from that project, and then talking about the solution details with the project team and handing that over to a project team for formal development and deployment. And this may look a little bit different depending on your specific organization. Within our organization, we have a team that's dedicated just to rapid prototyping. So our prototype team won't actually build out the end production solutions then. So that handover takes place to hand over the project from the rapid prototyping team to the team that would actually build out that production solution. But within your organization, that certainly could look a little bit different. And it could be the same team doing the rapid prototyping and then doing that production solution build out. But if that's the case, it's just important to draw still a specific time bound for that rapid prototyping project. So you have a clear end of the prototyping where that prototyping phase is over, and then you can transition into a more formal solution build out under a more formal project. I'll walk through a couple examples here. It looks like we've got about a half hour left, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So I've got 3 examples here that I'll walk through with all of you as far as some example projects that we've done. And these projects kind of really run the whole gamut from predictive analytics to kind of more so business process projects to dashboarding and web development projects. So the first one here is a project that we did with a state arts commission on grant allocation optimization. They came to us, and essentially what they do is they receive government funding to distribute to arts organizations each year. And their current business process was they had a bucket of funds. So say they had $100 in funds. Of course, it was much more than that, but just to keep numbers simple here, say they had $100 in funds, they would then get arts organizations across the state that would apply to them and say, hey, this is our mission, this is what we do, we'd like to receive some of your funding to support our organization. And that took place in a pretty manual process for them, where essentially they would have panels review all of those applications, assign a score to the application, and then they would kind of, via a trial and error approach, just go through manually allocating out those awards to see what the best approach was to grant those awards that year. So they came to us and wanted to automate that grant distribution process for 2 primary reasons. One, they wanted to drive more equity across the organizations that were applying, to make sure that they were really driving value where they wanted to, where their organization wants to have a more equitable approach and to have the biggest impact with the limited number of funds that they can grant. So that was one key item. And then the second piece, of course, was, this is just a pretty inefficient process that for them took them about a month or so to go through that process just by running through trial and error. So the approach that we took with them was, again, we started with that collaborative whiteboarding approach. And before we even got into the data, just started functionally trying to understand their need, understand their process, and understand how we could really drive the most value for them. And what we actually ended up doing was honestly more of a kind of a configurable business rules engine that automated that that automated the allocation of grants for them. And you can see on the right-hand side the kind of the process that we ended up taking for that. And a lot of the prototyping work that we did was actually on the business process side of things before we even got into really into the technology and into the numbers behind the solution for them. So we just started mapping out their process as far as the applicants that come in, and we put some rules there in place to be able to drive some of the value that they wanted. They wanted to focus on some groups that were traditionally considered a little more disadvantaged. So groups that were in more rural areas, groups that may have smaller organizational budgets, groups that were in more rural areas where there was oftentimes a lot less art projects going on, and minority groups as well. So we ended up splitting organizations out into different budget tiers based on that budget size. And we calculated those just based on the distribution of budget within all of the applicants and split it out into different tiers, had a base score for all of those groups, and then actually ended up adding in what we called an under-resourced multiplier, which was simply just able to bump scores for organizations that met any of the under-resourced items. And those were configurable for them, so they could change that in future years. But some of the ones that they were looking at were, if an organization's in a zone that's classified as a rural zone, if an organization is a minority-based organization, or if an organization is a low-budget organization. And we were able to give them a bump in their score based on the distribution of scores within that tier, just by looking at a fraction of a standard deviation boost to get a final score for those organizations. And then we're able to, through taking that tier-based approach and through adding in that under-resource multiplier, we're able to then get an initial award for each of those groups, apply business rules on top of that, and just cycle through to automate that whole process of distributing those awards to that groups. And this was actually a rapid prototyping project that was meant to be just a prototype, but actually they were thinking that they needed a bit of a more sophisticated solution here, and it turned out they just needed really a business rules engine with some math overlaid on top of that to automate it. So this actually ended up for them meeting their needs and becoming the production solution that they still use today. So some of the outcomes there were, for them, it saved weeks of manual labor while allocating those funds each year. It's a flexible solution for them that can grow over time. And then, of course, the most important component for them is it really helped them to better be able to serve some of those disadvantaged groups that they wanted to focus on. Another project that we did here, which was in the predictive analytics space, focused on student retention, where a university had come to us and wanted to explore the concept of being able to leverage predictive analytics to improve student retention. As many mid-sized universities are focusing now, they were facing smaller and smaller incoming classes. They were facing declining retention rates, and both to help their students succeed, of course, and students who retain throughout college and obtain degrees oftentimes achieve better success in their postgraduate lives. And of course, for the financial stability of the university, retaining students is also important there. And this was an example of a really undefined solution where they weren't sure if it was feasible. They wanted to know if they could predict student risk of attrition, but weren't quite sure if it was possible, and wanted to try things out with a rapid prototyping project. And the approach that we took for them, especially given that we were doing a pretty quick time-bound project, at least initially, was to start again with a functional model. So up on the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see what we ended up building out for a functional model. And there are, of course, a lot more components underneath each of those swim lanes. but we split out the reasons why students don't retain to be in these different areas, and belonging and integration, for academic reasons, for financial reasons, for just general demographic reasons, and then for institutional reasons. And we dove into the data that the university had there. And for that initial model, just worked with the data that they already had, the data that was readily available. And we're very aware of the data gaps that we had initially, but just wanted to build out a prototype model first to see, is this even possible? So before we get too far down the route of, building out a full user interface for this, building out a really robust cloud-hosted model for this, can we figure out over the course of 6 weeks or so, is this feasible? Is this possible? So that's what we ended up doing, was building out an initial model, and actually saw some pretty good results initially as far as the model performance goes. So ended up just randomly splitting the students into different groups there, as far as a pilot group versus a test group, to kind of test out the model, and ended up seeing pretty good results from that prototype the first year. So then we kind of scaled it up after that and took it out of that prototyping phase, and ended up scaling up the model, making it more robust and integrating additional data fields. And then actually ended up securing some grant funding in collaboration with that university to build it out into a more formal product where they can actually, be able to work with those results within more so of a case management solution. They were able to roll it out to additional universities as well. But that all started with the prototype there, which was really important to them before getting into that big spend on a project that they weren't sure if it was possible, to be able to prototype that out and prove out the feasibility of developing a model that would predict student attrition. The last project I want to talk about here is for actually a city. So we were working with the city, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to build out a custom website for citizens to be able to view and interact with demographic data at the neighborhood level. So the stakeholders for that would be individuals who may be part of a neighborhood organization or a neighborhood association. They may be grant writers who want to draw funds to specific neighborhoods for development projects, or just curious citizens. The business objective here from their perspective was to determine the tech stack for the production solution build-out, and to develop a clear vision of the solution requirements and the overall look and feel of the solution before dedicating the funds to build out that custom web application. So again, we took a pretty similar approach here, where we did an initial discovery session with the stakeholders to really identify the background behind the project, the data that they currently had for the project, and the data that they want to incorporate in the future, their technology constraints, and the end user experience needs. For this one, a big need was a really diverse range of end users, where you may have folks who are a little bit more sophisticated and well-versed in interacting with technology, and individuals who may not be quite as well-versed in interacting with technology. So we needed a really simple user interface and the ability to be able to print out reports in a very straightforward method in case anyone wanted to interact with those reports in a PDF or then a paper format. And we ended up rapidly putting together, based on that initial discovery session, which I know you can't see the details, but up in the upper right-hand side of the screen here, you can see kind of what one of those whiteboarding sessions may look like, where we split things out into data, technology, user experience, any additional requirements, and just kind of talk through all the different points that they have there. We ended up doing this over 2 sessions, where we built out that initial framework, let everyone think about it for a while, and then came back together to augment that with additional ideas. But based on that, we built out a dashboard to make their feedback a little bit more tangible, and iterated through that dashboard over the course of a few weeks with the final outcome actually being that we realized they did not truly need a custom website, and they really needed a dashboarding solution that was just hosted within a website. So from their perspective, that's a much quicker timeline to development. It's much cheaper to develop and much cheaper to maintain as well, as compared to a custom application. So the outcome for them was, now they are able to build out that dashboard in a production ready state, and really were able to save quite a bit of cost and quite a bit of time there in building out that solution. So as far as getting started with rapid prototyping goes, I know I walked through that framework that our team takes for projects, but really the components to getting started are quite simple for all of you. All that you really need are just a couple of key tenets here for any projects that you may want to do. Again, time bounding those projects, having a strong bias towards action in those projects, ensuring that you have tangible outputs and that you're getting iterative feedback on the output and on the prototype. And then as best as you can, having a dedicated team, or at least dedicated time within the individuals who are working on that prototype project. And that's honestly all that you need to get started. There's certainly no need to overcomplicate things. And that's the whole point of prototyping, is getting away from really overcomplicated project structures, not trying to over-engineer anything, but just having a very strong bias towards action, building out a prototype solution or a proof of concept solution, and getting feedback very, very frequently. Well, I wanted to make sure that we certainly had plenty of time for questions at the end, and I think we should have about 10 or 15 minutes left, which it looks like we do. So we'll stop talking now and open it up to any questions that you all may have.
All right, I think I have everybody unmuted, and we have the final results of that last poll as well. So looks like kind of a mix there of what people would be interested in.
It looks like application development and BI dashboarding were strong results there, which certainly makes sense. Those are two really strong cases for rapid prototyping projects, where it's pretty easy, even if it's just getting in front of a whiteboard and iterating through some designs in that manner. You don't even have to get into a wireframing tool like Figma to do this. You can just do that in front of a whiteboard. You can do that in a simple tool like Lucidchart or Lucid Spark to be able to kind of just sketch out low fidelity wireframes, either for a mobile application or for a dashboard that you're developing. And that's a really easy way to get started, and one that can often excuse me, and one that can oftentimes drive quite a bit of value as well.
And we do have a question in the Q&A from Beth Luther. Do your clients already have a prototype idea in mind when they call you, or does your whiteboard session narrow down and identify the prototype? Meaning, if we have a department or program with multiple variables and impacts, can you get us to identification or what we really need?
We do both there. It really just depends on where the client's at. Sometimes someone will come to us and say, hey, here's a specific problem that we're facing. Here's what we want to do as far as a solution goes. Can you help us to test out and prototype that solution for? So one example for that would be the higher education project I discussed, where the client came to us and said, here's our idea. We want to see if utilizing the data that we currently have, if we can build out a model to predict student risk of attrition. We don't know if it's possible, but can you help us to really prototype out that data solution and see if it's feasible to build a model that will be able to do that? So we focused that project specifically on on that solution. So that's certainly one approach. The other one is just through doing exactly that, through whiteboarding, where we go into to some clients and just sit down with them to talk about either a specific challenge they may be facing where they don't have a solution built out for that, and help to just pull out some of the details there around that problem and what the problem truly is, and then see if it makes sense to do a rapid prototyping project. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, or even for some clients, they just want to sit down and really just do a whiteboarding session to see if there's any way that we can help improve any of their processes. So they may not even have a one singular specific problem that they want to focus on, and we certainly do that as well. We just take a bit of a different approach depending on how much information the client has beforehand.
Excellent, thank you. We have another question from Drew Phillips. When faced with an entrenched but inefficient software development process, how do you transition to rapid prototyping?
Yeah, can you repeat that one more time?
I can.
Thank you.
When faced with an entrenched but inefficient software development process, how do you transition to rapid prototyping?
Yeah, I think if it's an entrenched process already that's already been implemented and it's already being used, we usually need one more discovery session for that before we transition to rapid prototyping, because oftentimes in instances like that, as I'm sure we're all aware, teams absolutely love to be able to vent about some of their challenges. And that's honestly a really good way to start with discovery. Is we'll try to sit down with the team utilizing that solution, and get all of their feedback as far as what they don't like with what they're utilizing and what they're seeing first, to make that team feel heard, and also because it's of course very beneficial. And we'll try to jot down some of those key pain points with the existing solution in an initial discovery session, and then we'll do a follow-up session after that to start to transition from that focus on the current solution to, okay, let's forget that for the time being. Let's do a little bit more open-ended discovery, open-ended solutioning here of not what are the issues with that current process or that current technology, because we've documented those, we'll come back to those, but what's the actual need? What's the background on the need? What business outcome are you trying to bring about from this? And focus a little bit more on the just general problem understanding side of things, as far as what service it is that software is serving for the company or for the organization or for the agency. And then we'll bring those together in a third session and see if there's a way for us to build out a prototype for that. It may be a proof of concept implementation of a new technology. It may just actually take the form of building out a new process to utilize within that existing software, where the prototype, instead of being more of a tangible software solution, may just be iterating through a new business process several different times there. And that's kind of the approach that we take there, going from hearing the issues with the current process to focusing on the need behind that process, and then bringing those two together in a final session. And after that third session is when we would make or not we, but then when the stakeholders or the client would make the determination of, okay, does this make sense to build out a rapid prototype of either a business process, proof of concept implementation of a new technology for us to try, or some sort of other rapid prototype.
I know, yeah, Matt brought that over. It didn't have, Brian didn't have any room in his office, so I was like, throw it in here, because there was nothing on that wall. So, like, no, I didn't know. Yeah, exactly. It's a nice little decoration next to Van Gogh.
So, Anderson, to kind of follow up on that, does that process get bureaucrats to change their minds, do you find? And then Beth has one more question after that.
The answer is it at least informs their way of thinking, and oftentimes I don't even know if change the mind is necessarily the way that I would frame it, but I would say it helps provide more information so that decisions can be made more accurately and with more understanding, especially with a prototype, and especially if you're talking about individuals who may not have as strong of a technology background. I think having a prototype in front of someone makes it a lot more tangible. One project we're working on currently is with it's actually with a university that wants to build out kind of a survey and website around school climate, but they've had a bit of a hard time really not defining what they want it to do, but conveying that idea to the decision makers, so to granting organizations, to school principals, to individuals who are running schools or school districts. So what we did for them was just help to take some of their ideas that they had in their mind, because they really knew what they wanted to do from a data perspective, but we're just having a hard time being able to communicate that. So for that prototype, we just ended up building out high fidelity wireframes in Figma, which is a wireframing tool, so that instead of just talking about this concept that they have, now they can actually talk about the concept and then do a screen share and walk through what those wireframes may look like, and be able to show an example of what that survey may look like, be able to show an example of what the results from that survey and that website may look like, and be able to actually kind of click through some of those features and functionality and make that a lot more tangible to those end users or those stakeholders. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily changing their minds, but it's just communicating the idea in a much more tangible way that then certainly may inform their decisions and perhaps change their minds.
Perfect. Thank you. And I see Steve is answering Beth's question, but I think my colleague Beth Justice may also be able to jump in on this one. What is the cost of the average model prototyping? Cost range will work. Will the SIPA mini grants, micro grants be able to be used towards such a project? And I believe the answer for that is yes.
So I can certainly speak to the typical duration and cost of projects, and then I'll leave the rest up to others. So, I mean, the cost of projects that we typically do, again, we time bound it to 4 to 6 weeks. So depending on the complexity of the project and how many individuals we have working on that, we try to keep the projects pretty affordable, because that's the point of a prototyping project, is not to have a huge project spend. So our projects typically range anywhere from about $15,000 to $60,000 for those projects. I know that's a pretty wide range, but it just depends on how complex that project is and how many individuals that we have working on that project.
Okay, perfect. And our micro grants range up to 6,500, and they cover, that one-time cost of getting something rolling set up. So it would definitely go towards that. And that is the last of the questions that we have, unless anyone has something they want to unmute and ask. I think we've reached the end. Thank you, Anderson, for this great presentation, and Steve and Blythe for being here to help us out. We definitely appreciate that for sure. Let me close the windows here so I can see my screen. If you have any more questions after we part, please don't hesitate to contact any of us with your questions, or for follow-up, get a demo for you specifically, get a quote, anything like that. We're happy to help out. Subscribe to our monthly newsletter for announcements of our future webinars that we have coming up, or any other resources that we can help you out with. We'll have this webinar up on our YouTube channel, hopefully shortly in the next day or two, so you can rewatch it if you have any questions, or you can share it with colleagues if you think it's something they might be interested in. And finally, we really want these webinars to be as relevant and informational as possible. So if you could take a minute or two to fill out the brief 3-question survey at the end that you'll be getting by email, we would really, really, really appreciate it. If that's all there is, I will let all you go. I hope you have a fantastic day.